Choosing what line to grind down can be an extremely important decision. Sometimes it takes months to get the tier 10, and then all of a sudden you realize you don't like the tank you've gotten. Yeah, I've had that all too many times. I remember back in the day when I ground the E3 thinking that it was going to be an absolute beast, and the thing was just so slow, only going like 25 before it got its buff. I hated it, and because of that, I wasted like 4 months grinding. Now, obviously, the E3 is a fantastic tank at this point, but was a very different vehicle when the game was just coming out. In today's video, I'm going to be breaking into every single tier 10 in the game. Obviously, I'm not also breaking into gameplay for every tier 10 because I don't have 39 replays on hand to show you all. But basically, I'm going to go through each of the tier 10s in my garage, talk a little bit about their characteristics and what makes each one of these really good for whatever playstyle you have. Because it is always a pain to grind down the wrong line, so I want to make sure people always get the thing that they want, because there are so many tanks in 9.1 that are fantastic, and I would say about half the videos I've made already, I've suggested grinding down the line, which... yeah, so let's start off with the Sheridan. In 9.1, this vehicle received 150 more damage per minute, it received more mobility, and more view range. Add all those together, and the Sheridan, which was already a pretty decent performing light if you knew how to run it, is now probably one of the best performing lights as long as you do well in it when it comes to a pub playstyle. If you really like the T49, then you will really like the Sheridan. They have very similar attributes of high alpha, great gun depression, and this tank can't even be penned with HE for a light tank. Now, there are some weak spots. You can shoot in between the track links, you can shoot on the back bottom and the front lower plate with high explosive, and sometimes if you turn the turret to the sides. But apart from that, this tank is completely covered in spaced armor, making it much harder for 183s to HE or any other high pen, high damage dealing, high explosive rounds. So because of that, it's actually a fantastic tank. It gets away with a lot, and being able to just poke a ridge and tap somebody for 560 feels absolutely amazing. But you do gotta keep in mind, this is not a brawler, so if you try to brawl mediums or lights and that's your playstyle, you're gonna die very quickly. This tank, while it has very big alpha and got a DPM buff, it doesn't have enough DPM to brawl a medium. It's got 2400 with Cali, which I would highly suggest to run on it. So yeah, you still gotta be careful with the Sheridan when poking opponents. You've got the least DPM by 400 when it comes to the medium class. Moving over to the M48 Patton, this vehicle and the M60 are both extremely similar tanks, but one of them cost money, this one being free. Now, the M48 Patton is an amazing do-it-all vehicle. American tanks are good at having mobility, penetration, DPM, gun depression, they basically have everything, and that's how I feel about the Patton. This tank, over the years, has gotten buffed in quite a good way. It's got 3267 DPM if you're running Cali, and upwards of 3500 DPM if you're running Gun Rammer. It's got really good penetration, enough to butter through most tier 10 opponents you're aiming at, pretty good accuracy at .317, great on-movement dispersion, and some of the best view range in tier 10, especially for the medium class. While the Patton is not the fastest at only 48 kilometers per hour, it does have a fantastic average power to weight of 20.3, which means that this tank almost always gets up to its top speed, and because the vehicle weighs just around 50 tons, it makes it great for ramming other mediums and lightly armored opponents. M48 Patton carries some very solid gun depression values, and apart from the slightly weak turret cheeks, this tank's actually a fantastic hull-down vehicle for brawling against other tanks like the STB-1 and Object 907. Because of that, while the M48 Patton may not be the most exciting tier 10 out there, and if you really want to get something that's out of the box, there definitely are better options, I would say that the M48 Patton is still one of the best do-it-all tanks. If you want a role that you can feel comfortable doing almost anything in, that's where you'll put this American tier 10 medium. Moving over to the American tier 10 heavy, we have the T110E5. Now, this is one of the more bland tier 10s, I'll definitely admit. It doesn't have alpha, it doesn't really have DPM, and it doesn't have the most armor. Now, it has armor in certain spots. It's got great hull down capabilities with 8 degrees degrees of gun depression, and quite a strong turret at that, and virtually no hatch after Wargaming removed it, this vehicle hull down is quite a worthy opponent to fight. And even though it might not have nearly as much DPM as it used to in the old days, this tank still does have its 374 millimeters of heat penetration, enough to butter through almost anything that makes its way in front of you. As well, the T110E5 has pretty good mobility now, going 42 kilometers per hour forward, but oh, still keeping that 12 in reverse of the American speed. That is quite atrocious. The great thing about the E5, and the only reason I would suggest to grind it, is if you really want that accuracy. 0.299 combined with a 2.8 second aiming time is absolutely amazing. And because of that, this gun almost rarely misses any shell it fires, making it actually quite an enjoyable experience, taking away the RNG factor. But at the same time, if you play a vehicle that has, extra 500-600 DPM like a WZ-113, even though you might have worse accuracy, you'll probably make up for it just because you're shooting so many more shells. Taking a look at the M6 Yo, this is definitely the better option when compared to the T110E5. Not only does this vehicle have more DPM with both of its guns, but this is an autoloader. You can run a 3-shell, which has 3,000 damage per minute, very solid pen on both of its ammunitions on AP and heat, and it's able to get out 900 damage in a matter of 5 seconds from the first shell, featuring fantastic aiming time and dispersion. Not to mention, you have a secondary gun option, which sure, you drop 500 DPM, but you're able to deal 450 damage with each shell, 2 shells with a 1.71 second intraclip, making the M6 Yo dump out 900 damage in 1.71 seconds. So it's pretty insane. You've got a little bit worse standard pen, worse premium pen, even worse accuracy and aiming time, but sometimes being able to dump out a 183's worth of damage in 2 seconds is pretty insane. Now, I would say that personally the 3-shot is a better gun if you want to win more, especially with shell reload boost now, which takes away 30% of the time of each shell in the magazine's intraclip. Yeah, you're going to have like a 1.8, 1.9 second intraclip when you're running shell reload boost for both of your shells, which gives you upwards of 3,300 DPM when you've ran the equipment. So I would suggest, if you're going to get the Yo, to run the 3-shot because it's a little more enjoyable at this point just to pull out very easy wins with the insane DPM this vehicle has. The Yo is a great tank for those players that like a reliable tier 10 heavy that also has a bit of something interesting going for it. The armor profile is very unique, as you clearly can tell, and its whole playstyle is very unique. Both of the guns you'll run on this tank are some of the weirdest guns in the game, and the great part is, unlike the E100 where the stock gun is definitely just an awful choice, both of the guns on this vehicle are great choices. So if you get bored with the 3-shot, you can go hop over to the 2-shot and then have a lot of fun with that and then swap back. So I think that the Yo is a very good option for just having fun if it's one of your only tier 10s, because you got 2 different gun options that feature very different play styles. This tank carries 10 degrees of gun depression, very solid armor, decent mobility, and even an ability that if you get shot, your reserve track pops in and still lets you reverse at 5 kilometers per hour. The M6 Yo is definitely one of the best tier 10 heavies out there, and one that I definitely fear a bit if there's a good player driving it. The T57 Heavy is a vehicle that, well, it's just got everything going for it. Even armor at this point is pretty solid on it. It's definitely not the most armored tier 10. You can penetrate it quite easily in the frontal plate and the turret cheeks if you know how to aim, but at the same time, taking a snapshot or just aiming at a competent T57 Heavy driver, and that turret will get more bounces than you'd ever believe. The T57 Heavy is basically the M6 Yo, just with a higher clip damage, but the same DPM. So we're going to be sitting at 3,100 damage per minute in the T57 Heavy, which is actually pretty insane when you realize that this is an autoloader. And if you're running shell reload boost, your already quick 2.5 intraclip to deal 1,200 damage is going to go down to the same as the Yo of 1.9. So yeah, the T57 Heavy is going to be able to get out all of its 1,200 damage when you run shell reload boost in around 4 seconds, which is just insane when you think about it. T57 Heavy is one of the best guns in tier 10. It's still got 374 heat pen, and even though the accuracy was nerfed a bit in update 9.1, it's still does not affect the overall playstyle of this vehicle and what makes it so darn strong. Here's what I'll say about the 57. On paper, it's an amazing tank. In actual playstyle, there's a lot of people that do very bad in it. There's a reason why this vehicle was changed again in Update 9.1, and it still probably will be one of the weaker performing heavies because it sacrifices a lot of its armor and mobility to just get the damage out. And when it comes to a lot of players, yeah, people don't really understand how to play this tank and get that damage out effectively without bleeding health and dying themselves. So the 57 Heavy is really only a good tank if you understand the key concepts of how to hide your vehicle, put it in the right positions, and punish your opponents for poking while trying to take as minimal damage as possible in return. If you like getting out massive chunks of damage, this is definitely a fantastic tank, but you gotta know what you're doing or it's going to be just an awful tank to drive. When it comes to the T110E4, this vehicle has fantastic accuracy. I haven't actually made a video on this tank yet, but I do know it's sitting at 0.308 dispersion after 9.1, which is absolutely insane. It's actually one of the most accurate tank destroyers in the game now. When it comes to aiming time of 4.3 seconds, nothing crazy, but it's good enough to deal with most of the opponents that pop in front of you. When it comes to its average penetration, you're not going to struggle with anything. Your standard ammo's got 300 millimeters, and your premium upwards of 394. Yeah, I hate to break it to you heavies, but you're going to be buttered straight through even the E100 with its buffed turret cheeks. When it comes to the E4, it's honestly a very fun tank. It's got the playstyle of a heavy in later aspects of the game. So in the beginning of the game, you can stay at the back of the map, use your good camo, use your fantastic accuracy, and just get pot shots into the enemy. You know, let's say you're on dead rail or mines and people poke the hill. You can sit at the back, conserving your HP and getting nice shells in. But the great part about the E4 is that then you can drive in later when a lot of the heavies have already bled their health, and you can sit right up in the front line and brawl them. And judging that you've got way more pen and way more alpha, half the time the E4 wins the brawl. Honestly, the E4 is an amazing tank. It's definitely one of my more favorited tier 10 tank destroyers, and that's exactly why. It can do the role of a heavy when it's needed to. You compare that to a vehicle that can't, let's say like the 4005, and that takes away a lot of the wins you'll play in a 4005 compared to the wins you can easily pull out in a T110E4. Now the E3 is a much more heavily armored version of the E4. This vehicle actually has 2 more degrees of gun depression. Instead of sitting at 6, it sits at 8. As I said, American vehicles just really like to have good gun depression. The E3 traded alpha for DPM, or the other way around, DPM for alpha. So it went from around 2900 DPM in the previous update to 2650. Now this is if you're running Cali, but still, it's a pretty big DPM loss. It makes the reload almost the same as the pre-change to E100. But to keep in mind, the E3 has some of the best armor in tier 10. That hatch on the roof, it may look like the E4's hatch, but it's not even close. Even with high penetration heat shells or premium shells, you're gonna struggle to penetrate the E3's hatch. Now, that's not to say there aren't weak spots. You can penetrate through the track wheel extremely easy, and this little driver hatch up here can actually be a high explosive pen if you get unlucky. I would say the really worst part about the E3 is the fact that its tracks are just so weak, and, well, at traverse speed, the E3 has one of the worst power to weight ratios in the game at 8. Yeah, it's awful. What it says on paper here of 13.7 isn't really correct when you add in the terrain resistances. So because of that, yeah, the E3, it really averages about 20 to 15 kilometers per hour, and that's not great by any means. You got to be very careful when driving this tank. And when you take a look at that reverse speed of only 10, yeah, if you put your tank too aggressive, you're going to struggle to get out of that spot. Now, you do have super speed boost, but the problem with super speed boost is that you only get it every 78 seconds, so you got to be careful. Another thing to be careful about with the E3 is running double consumables. I wouldn't suggest it. You can see for me, I'm only running improved engine power, because as a tank destroyer, especially one with such weak tracks, if you take off another consumable, you have a very high chance of being tracked in game and absolutely destroyed. So because of that, the E3 is... it's a mixed opinion for me. I think that it's a great tank in some games and a very, very poor vehicle in other games. So to me, I wouldn't fully suggest to grind this tank, especially because it is such a slow vehicle. It will get very boring very quick. But if you like the frontline playstyle, but you also like having a massive alpha of a tank destroyer, then the E3 is definitely up your alley, because it can do both. This tank, unlike the E4, can get right in the front line at the beginning of the game and stay there the entire entire battle. Even with people spamming HE, the armor holds up quite well on this vehicle, and as long as you pen your shells, I mean, people are going to be scared to poke a tank that they can't pen, dealing 680 damage back. The Leopard 1 is our first German, and the Leopard 1 is honestly an amazing tank. I made my video on it just a few days ago, and the Leopard has basically everything it previously had in update 9.0, but just better. It has an extra 100 DPM, which is amazing. The Leopard 1 now sits at 3,772 damage per minute, and judging that it still has the most accurate gun in tier 10, plus some of the most mobility at 66 kilometers per hour, the Leopard 1's basically got everything going for it. Now, that doesn't mean you should grind down this line. If you're a beginner, don't grind down this line. And this isn't even really a suggestion. This is just kind of saying don't grind down this line. The Leopard is not a tank for beginners. This is the kind of tank that the equivalent of an F1 driver would use in real life. Like, you don't just go straight up to F1 when you want to get your racing career started. You start off low. And that's the thing about the Leopard. This tank has no armor on the turret, on the hull, anywhere. And inexperienced players, 90% of the time, put themselves in really poor situations and get absolutely bullied by the mediums that do have armor, like the E100, the E50M, not the E100, yeah, E50M, the STB1, the M48 patent. They will absolutely smoke a Leopard 1 because you may have the most DPM in the game, but it doesn't change the fact that you don't have hull down capabilities. So the Leopard 1 is amazing as long as you understand its playstyle. If you really know how to play a medium, then this can be by far one of the most enjoyable tanks in tier 10, with the fact of its unrivaled mobility, its great camo, its fantastic view range, and the fact that it's got everything on the DPM and the gun. I mean, what wouldn't make this tank fun to drive? The E50M is kind of the alternative, which is, in my opinion, just kind of a more fun Leopard 1. The E50M has 60 kilometers per hour, which for a tank that weighs 62 tons is pretty ridiculous, having a power to weight ratio of 21.2. The E50M also carries 3129 DPM, and if you're running gun rammer, it's upwards of 3365 DPM, enough to quite easily deal with your opponents. Now, obviously, it's not the 3700 the Leopard has, but still not bad DPM, judging that you've got actual armor. In fact, this tank is basically a Tiger 2, just given a massive engine that can actually go upwards of 60. So I think the E50M is an amazing tank, and this is definitely one of the best options in tier 10. The fact that it's so mobile, the fact that it's got so much armor, and that you can have so much fun in it without actually bleeding too much, it's definitely an amazing tank. That doesn't mean you can just YOLO into the battlefield immediately and get away with everything. You'll probably die very quickly. The E50M side armor is quite bad, especially if you over-angle it. Its track wheels can be a nuisance, and because of that, you still gotta know what you're doing, but it can definitely get away with a lot more compared to almost every other tier 10 medium available on the tech trees. The E100 is, well, it's a German super heavy, and when it comes to German super heavies, it's strong. The E100 got a massive turret buff by 20 millimeters in update 9.1, meaning that literally everything that tries to penetrate the turret now really struggles. It was a much needed buff in some ways because there's a lot of players out there that struggle in the E100. I would not suggest to grind the E100 if you're a beginner at the game. While the Tiger 2 line is one of the best lines out there, driving a super heavy is not the best idea for beginners because half the time you see them driving in bad spots, camping at the back of the map, not really supporting the team, or, you know, just putting your tank in a bad situation, and when you miss a shot in a vehicle like this and you get absolutely torn apart, it really doesn't help the team all too much. So driving a vehicle like an IS series is a lot more enjoyable, I find, than getting a big ol' super heavy and just feeling out of position. But if you understand how to angle your super heavies, the E100 is an absolutely amazing choice. This vehicle, with the new turret armor and the fact that it still carries its big ol' 640 Alpha slap, makes it one of the most enjoyable tier 10 heavies out there. I mean, after just playing this tank a few times with this increased mobility as well, the E100 feels absolutely fantastic. It's definitely a better option than what we're going to talk about in a second, the VK7201K. And yeah, if you like Alpha, you like big ol' hit points at 2950, and the ability to just not care about the enemy shooting at you, the E100 really is a fantastic option out there. It might get a little boring because it is slower, but still an amazing tank. The VK72 I honestly wouldn't suggest to grind. In update 9.1 it got almost nothing changed. It goes 2 faster and that's about it. And I gotta say the E100 getting its turret buff kind of just outclassed the VK72. So to me, I wouldn't really recommend grinding down this tank, especially because the grind of the line isn't the best, you know? It's not bad at all, but when you're playing down the line stock, you're definitely going to struggle compared to the E100 getting the Tiger 2 and every other fantastic tank like the E75. It's a much easier grind. I would say the VK72 is fun if you really, really like rear-turreted tanks. That's really the only reason I would say to grind this, because its frontal armor is great, you know, but it's also the fact that you've got no spaced armor on the sides, unlike the E100, meaning that any HES shells from a 4202 or a 183 will butter straight through you. Now that the FE2 and 5B has its HES as well, it'll butter through your sides. So at this point in time, I would say that the VK72, it's definitely a troubled child. It's an amazing tank in some games, but it's also got such poor DPM, its accuracy isn't great, so I would just stick with the 100 if you want to get a super heavy. Now, the mouse is actually one of the top performing heavies in the game, and the reason behind that is just because it's got so many darn hit points. Even if you're not good at the game, it doesn't matter if you can just drive into the enemy and waste their time while your teammates take advantage of them. So, the mouse is a great tank. Again, I wouldn't suggest to grind the mouse if you don't understand how to angle. While it is a very good tank for beginners just because it gives your team a lot of opportunity to farm off you, it's not a tank you'll find very exciting after your first couple of games or so. Just because the mouse might be the heaviest tank in the game does not mean it's going to do the most damage or have the most armor. In fact, there are many Russian heavies that weigh half the weight of a mouse or 1/3 the weight that still can bounce twice or triple the shells. The mouse is known for bouncing shells and having fantastic hit points. That way you can just trade shells with your opponents and win the brawl almost every single time, unless they have more DPM, or penetration, or mobility, or a lot of attributes. The mouse is great, but definitely not a tank I pull out every now and then because it gets very boring very quickly. It's the slowest tier 10, only going 25, and yeah, it's definitely a tank that you're not going to want to play after a crazy amount of battles. Definitely a fantastic tier 10 to grind if you love your German super heavies, but I wouldn't suggest to grind it, especially if it's one of your only tier 10s that you want to go for, because it will get very boring very fast. Make our way to the Jagdpanzer E100, and honestly, this is just a fantastic tank. Now, just like the E100, I wouldn't suggest to grind this if you're new to the game. I mean, you're going to do really bad in it. It's one of the most situationally inflexible tanks in tier 10. But if you understand where to position your tank destroyers, kind of think of this as a bigger E4. Just like the T57 E4, when you're at the beginning of the game, you can stay at the back of the map, use your camo, which it doesn't really have much of, but still stay at the back, get some big ol' slaps into your opponents for 800, and then, you know, drive into the front line at the end of the game when your teammates need you because they're down on HP. And judging that the Yag got a hit point buff, and now it's sitting upwards of 2,279 hit points, and the fact that it actually got an aiming time boost, it's pretty insane. It also got the same armor buff as the E100. I mean, the Yag is definitely up there for one of the better tier 10 tank destroyers at this point, especially because it's not really a tank destroyer. It's more of a heavy with the hit points and the armor that it has, plus the fact that it's still got the alpha and the pen and the DPM. The Yag is just going to be an amazing tank, and definitely one I'm a little scared to fight in the future on the battlefield. So if you know how to play this tank, it can be amazing, but same thing as the mouse, it will get very boring very fast. I don't think there's many people out there that every single day want to play the Yag for 20 battles. Definitely not a tank I would suggest to grind if it's one of your only tier 10s. Maybe after you got about 5 or 6 of them, I'd say this is a good vehicle to start looking at. Grill 15, let's be real, it got nerfed really hard. It's got 3,400 DPM with Rammer and around 3,200 DPM with Kali. It's got a good gun. Even with its DPM nerf, it still has fantastic DPM. It's got some of the best accuracy in tier 10, but it did lose its alpha. It went from 640 down to 600, which is definitely not amazing. It got a bit better traverse speed, but still quite poor. The Grill is one of those tanks where it's really fun to play, but it's also really unfun to play sometimes. If your team falls apart, the Grill is going to be one of the most poor tanks you can play in the battlefield, just because of how fast it does fall apart. And it's also got really bad camo, because Wargaming still has decided not to buff it. So what I would say about the Grill is, if you really like staying at the back of the map, using a fantastic accuracy gun, this is a fun tank, but it definitely gets boring fast. It's a tank that can be very frustrating when watching your team fall apart, and it's a vehicle that really isn't the most influential tier 10. There's better options out there when it comes to tank destroyers. But I think the Grill's a fun tank, and if you like this type of playstyle, definitely a fantastic vehicle at that. T100LT, even though it was nerfed, it is still an overpowered vehicle. We talked about it in my tier list, and it's the fact that it carries a 20-second spotting mechanic, and it still has really solid DPM for a light tank sitting at 3,156, which is pretty fantastic. The LT is just a great tank to grind in general. If you like mobility, you like armor, you like DPM, you like accuracy, you like pen, you like spotting. Oh, is that everything? Yeah, it is. The LT's still got everything you'd want, even though it's nerfed. It's just an amazing vehicle, and grinding down the line is pretty easy as well. The MT25 is amazing. LTG is maybe not the best tank, but you can also get the LTTB, which is super fun. Lightweight is a great tank. Object 84 is honestly dumb on how stupid its armor can be. And yeah, the T100 LT, I mean, it's just the cherry on top. I would highly recommend, if you have not ground a light tank, that this is your first light. It's got everything you'd want, and the most mobility, going at 72 kilometers per hour. Highly suggest this tank, super fun, and yeah, I mean, with the spotting mechanic, it's definitely one of the top-notch vehicles out there. Now, speaking of mobility, this is the Object 140 that in Update 9.1 traded a bit of its armor to gain mobility. It goes 60 kilometers per hour now from its 56, has a better power-to-weight ratio, but at the trade of its turret armor, and a lot of it at that. You can basically butter through the turret. I was playing in my 4202 earlier today, and I literally penned the roof of a 140 turret 3 times in a row with Hesh. So, you gotta be careful. The 140 will fall apart within a matter of seconds if you have the opportunity to fire any high penetration or even average penetration round at its turret. But it also got buffed camo, which means that you can run this tank sort of like a light tank. And if you run it correctly, yeah, the 140 can be an absolutely amazing tank to drive. It's super fun to drive because of its mobility. And unlike the LT that did get its CPM nerf, the Object 140 still sits at 3,600, making it actually a very viable option to fight light tanks in, down to the fact that now you're basically a T100 LT just with a little bit of a different skin. The T62A is honestly kind of a boring tank. I wouldn't suggest to grind it. The 62A is faster in Update 9.1, going 55, but at the cost of much worse dispersion, 0.317. Its aiming time is okay, but it has much worse dispersion than it used to, which was sitting at 0.372. Or 0.272. And the problem with me is, why drive this tank when you've got other options? Especially because, to me, the 62A is quite a boring tank. It's got a lot of good attributes going for it. Decent turret armor, great all-down capabilities, good mobility now, and even pretty good DPM. But the problem is, like, why play this tank when you can play a 140, or, you know, you can get an STB1 or a Vickers Light? There's just so many other options that are way more enjoyable. This would be one of the last tanks I would actually suggest to grind in Tier 10, especially because the line itself is pretty outdated to get up to the Tier 10 with. The T44, it's not a bad tank, but definitely not a great tank either in Tier 8 anymore. The T54 is a pretty solid tank, but struggles a bit on its penetration, and yeah, I just wouldn't suggest it. The T43 is quite a bad grind, I would say. So, the 62A, it's not bad. You know, I wouldn't say no to grinding it, but definitely there's better options you can play. The IS-7 got nerfed on its top speed and a little bit on its power-to-weight ratio in Update 9.1. Went from 50 to 45 kilometers per hour, and its power-to-weight went from 17.7 down to 17.1. Apart from that, the tank is exactly the same it used to be. In fact, it actually gained a traverse speed. The IS-7, I don't know why people keep saying it's kind of worse than it was before. I'd say it's just as good as it used to be. It's still got the troll armor, still got big ol' alpha, and it's still got a troll hecky gun. Its accuracy actually got a little bit worse. It went from 0.362 to 0.380, which is quite bad, or 0.37. So, yeah, it lost a bit of accuracy, but the IS-7 is still a great tank for players that just want to be able to get away with poking out sideways. I would highly suggest, if you are new to the game and you don't have a Tier 10, or you're still thinking about what line to grind, get the IS-7. It really is just one of the easiest tanks to make mistakes, and if you poke sideways accidentally, you'll bounce shells. I mean, the side armor's ridiculous. If you show your frontal plate, you'll bounce shells. You have no weak spots on your turret. The IS-7's got alpha, it's got mobility, it's got everything you'd want for a heavy, especially a beginner heavy out there, and that's the exact same thing I would say for the IS-4. The IS-4 is a bit more of a robust IS-7. It doesn't have nearly as much side armor, its frontal armor isn't nearly as strong, but it does have a much better turret, a much better gun when it comes to penetration and accuracy, and the most important thing about the IS-4 is the fact that it has 2,809 hit points, making it one of the healthiest hit point mobile heavy tanks in tier 10 right up there with the AMX M454. The difference is that you don't need to run sandbags on this tank, you do on the AMX M4. Because of that, I think the IS-4 is one of the best tier 10 heavies out there. As long as you understand how to use those hit points and trade with your opponents, and they're almost always going to be loading heat on you, you actually win the trades most of the time. I would say the IS-4 is just as good of a grind as the IS-7. The reason why I suggested the IS-7 over the IS-4 is because grinding down the not the IS-8, but the ST-1 is awful stock. The IS-8 is bad stock, but the ST-1 is probably the worst stock tank you can ever drive. The KV-4 stock is awful. KV-3 stock is awful. The whole line is quite atrocious stock. And if you don't know how to manage grinding down your lines, then yeah, the IS-4 is probably the worst tank line to grind down. So while the tier 10 may be worth it, yeah, I wouldn't necessarily suggest to grind and get the IS-4 until you have a decent chunk of free XP saved up. When it comes to the Object 268, honestly, this is one of the flat-out best tier 10 tank destroyers that you can get your hands on. It has fantastic accuracy for a 670 alpha. It's got really good aiming time, which makes it fantastic for snapping shells, and 50 kilometers per hour, plus a great traverse speed now of upwards of 45 degrees a second. Its gun arc is fantastic. Its gun depression is really solid. The 268 is kind of like how I talked about the Patton earlier. It's just a do-it-all tank destroyer. It can literally do it all. And because of that, I would highly suggest that if you haven't ground a tank destroyer yet, this is the first one you start off with. It's got mobility, it's got everything. Why wouldn't you want to grind this? And now that it got alpha increased, I think it's actually a more fun vehicle. 268 is just a fantastic vehicle. It's got really no downside, and should I mention that it has the best camo for a tier 10 tank destroyer in the game. Now the 263 sounds similar to the 268. It doesn't look anything like it, and neither does it play anything like it. The 263 has 3,875 DPM, or something like that. Yeah, 56, which means it has the highest DPM in Tier 10, although vehicles like the Leopard are getting pretty close, and the Badger does have the same DPM, but when it comes to a tech tree, this is the highest you'll be able to achieve. When it comes to the 263, it features a great top speed of 50 kilometers per hour, very good power-to-weight ratio, and some of the strongest frontal armor for a tank destroyer, but I would not suggest to ever grind this line unless you are experienced at the game. First of all, the Tier 9 SU-122-54 is an awful tank for anybody that doesn't understand how to play the game. Same for the SU-101 and the SU-100M1. Because of that, this whole line is awful if you don't know how to play this game, and yeah, you'll definitely struggle grinding down it. Once you get to the Tier 10, it still carries the same features as the Tier 9, the Tier 8, the Tier 7 carry. Very poor gun depression, only sitting at 4 degrees, and the fact when you add that in with the very poor gun arc and the not so great penetration, the 263 falls apart very quickly if you don't understand where to position it. It's an amazing tank if you use the DPM. You get that mobility into the front line and you can use that armor to just absolutely smash through mediums, but you got to know where to position it. So if you think that you can position this tank correctly and use it in the front line the way it should be, this is one of the best tier 10s, hands down. But if you can't, it's one of the worst. Vickers Light, honestly, just an amazing tank. Wargaming changed its mobility to be better in Update 9.1. They changed its gun to actually be accurate, sitting at 0.299 dispersion now, or actually 0.29 dispersion, making it one of the most accurate lights in Tier 10 and mediums. Because of this, I also think the Vickers Light is another fantastic do-it-all vehicle. This is another light that I would say, just like the 200 LT, can be a first light to grind down. Not only does it have great mobility, it's got 10 degrees of gun depression, pretty solid hull armor that can actually get bounces, but it's got great view range. It's got everything you'd want for a light tank, so it's a fantastic vehicle, and if you like Hesh, well, this vehicle actually gets Hesh, dealing a pretty decent chunk of damage at it, 440. This is basically like running the stock gun on the FE4202. But speaking of the 4202, if you have your option, I'd suggest to go for the 4202 first over the Vickers Light, due to the fact that this tank's just a heck of a lot more fun. You've got AP ammo, and then you've got flat Hesh, which has 231 millimeters of pen, dealing 440 damage a shot. If you're able to use the 4202 correctly, it will absolutely demolish enemy opponents. It also has a great top speed of 60 kilometers per hour, 10 degrees of gun depression, and in the latest update, it actually got armor buffed, which means that the 4202 is amazing, but there is one downside, and this is just the fact. If you're new to the game, do not grind this line. It's not even a suggestion. If you're new and you're trying to learn Tier 10 still, this is not a tank for you, because the Hesh is extremely unreliable, and if you spam people with Hesh and you don't bend your shells, you're literally just going to be a useless Tier 10 that you might as well not be driving. driving. So the 4202, it's a great tank, but it's not a beginner option. I would wait, maybe get 3, 4, or even 5 tier 10s before you even think about grinding down this line. But once you do start grinding down it, if you understand how to position a medium, the 4202 is one of the most enjoyable tier 10s that you can get your hands on. The FE2 and 5B is a tank that, again, don't grind as a beginner. It is not even close to a beginner vehicle. This tank sacrifices armor for DPM, and fantastic DPM accuracy levels at that. It's got Hesh with 190 millimeters of pen. The FE2 and 5B is definitely amazing when it comes to tier 10 heavies, but not a tank that a beginner should ever grind. When it comes to most of the British vehicles, none of them are beginner worthy. They're all incredibly unique, and that's what makes them so fun to play. But yeah, if you don't understand the playstyle of the 2 and 5B, the fact that its armor doesn't really work, those numbers on the gun may be deceiving, but I'll put it like this. If you got less than 4 tier 10s or even 5, do not grind down this line. The whole line is pretty painful to grind down. The Carnarvon stock is awful. The Conqueror stock is probably the worst thing you'll ever see in your life. And once you get to the 2 and 5B, you're probably just not going to enjoy it all that much. This tank definitely gets boring after a lot of playing, and I just wouldn't suggest it when there's other tier 10s that are just as fun. When it comes to the FE4005, this is a tank that is amazing and at the same time not amazing. In certain games, you know, if you're a really skilled player like me or any other player that's somewhat competent in the battlefield, you can pull out a 4005 and just absolutely nuke and ravage the enemy hit points. You can get 1640 out in a matter of 5 seconds if you're running shell reload boost, which is enough to literally cripple any tier 10. Even a super heavy, you get to take over half of their health off. But there is problems. The 4005 may have damage, but it's the same thing as the 183. It has no armor. It's a massive box that everybody can shoot at, and it's got a long old clip reload. So because of that, if you misposition this tank, you're very quickly going to find yourself in a spot where you're going to die. And even if you do everything right, the problem with the 4005 is if your team falls apart, yeah, again, you're basically going to die. So here's what I'll say about the 4005. It's an amazing vehicle. If you understand how to run it, it's honestly a tank that will never get boring down to the fact of its clipping capabilities. But at the same time, it's definitely not a tank you should ever grind if you're a beginner or a player that doesn't like being able to not frontline, because you really can't frontline in this vehicle, especially after its latest update. When it comes to the FE2 and 5B 183, this is a tank I never suggest anybody to grind, down to the fact that it's not a fun tank. Apart from dealing 1300 damage, you're going to miss 90% of your shells. You're going to get frustrated you're missing shells. It's got one of the worst camo values in tier 10, and it's actually got one of the worst armor values as well. It can't frontline. It really can't snipe because of its terrible accuracy, and there's just better options. I mean, why drive a 183 when you can drive a Yag that's only got 100 less alpha and literally has armor, hit points, everything going over it? Why would you ever grind down this line? So the 183 is funny for the big ol' slap that you get out once every now and then, but it's literally a useless tank. If you're a beginner and you choose to grind on this line first, you are hurting your account, and there's really no reason to do that. So I wouldn't suggest it, but hey, I guess if you enjoy the 183 and the Big Ol' Alpha, maybe it's up your play style, but I wouldn't suggest it. The STB1 is a fantastic tier 10 medium. While it may have lost a bit of accuracy in update 9.1, it still carries its great frontline capabilities. If you want a medium that can just brawl in the frontline, haul down, this is your tank. It just does not care about how much pen you have as long as you're using it with its gun depression. The STB is basically the Type 71 of mediums. It's great, does everything well. It's got good DPM, it's got okay accuracy now, but it's really just the frontline haul down armor that you'd want. If you like that kind of haul down play style, this is definitely your choice, especially because I think it's a little bit more fun than the Patton. When it comes to the Type 71, the Type is another absolutely amazing tank. Just like the IS-7, this is another option I would highly suggest to grind down if you haven't already, especially if you're a beginner. I would say this tank's even better than the IS-7. First of all, grinding down the line, Type 68's great, Shisei's great, Judo's great, Junu's great. The only one that's awful is the Mitsu 108 that it seems like Wargaming's actually buffing in update 9.2. When it comes to the Type 71, it's got fantastic mobility, going 40 kilometers per hour. It's got some of the most ridiculous traverse speed down to its super mobility buff, and because of that, this tank just feels absolutely amazing and a definitely go-to vehicle. It might not have the most DPM or turret traverse, but you don't really need it when your hull can traverse at 50 degrees a second. The Hoary is honestly a tank I don't suggest to grind, and the reason behind it is two. First of all, it gets quite boring. There's no skill in this tank, you just tap the premium shells and everything becomes a pen. So there's really no skill in aiming or trying to do anything against your opponents, you just pen everything. And second of all, it's because you pen everything I wouldn't suggest to grind this. This tank is not really that fun of a tank to fight against. It's, in fact, I would say the Hoary is actually less enjoyable to fight than the 183, down to the fact that, like, at least the 183 has the chance of not hitting you, it won't pen you if you're using your armor. The Hoary doesn't care what armor you have. If you're playing right and you're trying to frontline, the Hoary will just butter straight through your frontal armor. So because of that, I wouldn't suggest to grind the Hoary. It's just really not that fun to play in because of its kind of lackluster alpha, the fact that it's just this big old box that doesn't look that great, and yeah, for the average player, I don't even think it's that good of a vehicle. The Hoary is definitely an amazing tank if you know how to drive it, but when it comes to the average player out there grinding down the Hoary Type 2 and the Hoary Type 1, it's really just the Cheeto SPG that's amazing. There's definitely better options. Again, the 268 has more alpha by over 100 now. 268 has better mobility, better traverse speed. I mean, why play the Hoary when you can play a higher alpha, more enjoyable, better camo tank destroyer with better gun depression? That's the problem with the Hoary. When we take a look at the WZ121, this is just an amazing tier 10. The 121 has fantastic mobility, especially after its power to weight got buffed again in update 9.1. It's got 3,440 DPM, it's got ridiculous aiming time, and 420 alpha. The 121 is the best brawling medium. Yes, the E50M is great. I believe this one's better. Its upper plate is amazing, its turret is amazing, its mobility is amazing, and the alpha's better. I think the 121 is the best brawling medium. If you like frontline capabilities, and you like alpha, and DPM, and aiming time, get the 121. No questions asked. It's just an amazing tank, and it will definitely do everything you want it to on the front line. Now, the 121 definitely has some weaknesses, and that big weakness is the ammo rack. If it gets hit in the ammo rack, there's actually a pretty high chance you'll go up in flames, but I guess that's just a risk you're willing to take. WZ120, after it got buffed to 5 degrees of gun depression, is one of the best tier 10s out there. T34 too, might not have the most DPM, but it still carries that 400 alpha and fantastic heat penetration of 275. T34-1 is just one of the best tier 7s in the game, so really the only tank that's bad is the Type 58, and at that point, who cares? It's down at tier 6. I would highly recommend for a medium that this is one of your first, being the 121. When it comes to the WZ113, this vehicle in update 9.1 became an absolute freaking beast. It was already a beast. It had 3,440 DPM, the same as the 121, but now that this tank has its traverse speed, it's just as good as the 121. It's got traverse, it's got armor, it's got DPM, it's got mobility of 45 kilometers per hour, and pen. The 113 is just an absolutely fantastic tier 10 heavy. And if you like frontline capabilities and the fact that this thing has the most DPM, it'll be great. But I would not suggest for this to be even close to one of your first tier 10s. Due to the fact that the 113 has very poor frontal armor, very poor side armor, and a track wheel that's incredibly weak, any player that understands how to take apart your 113 will still do it with relative ease. So because of that, I wouldn't suggest to grind the 113 just yet. Get the IS-7, get the Type 71, get the 121. They're a lot easier to play, and honestly, I think a little bit more enjoyable. When it comes to the 113 GFT, this and the Object 268 are two of the best tank destroyers in my opinion to grind. The WZ113 GFT has amazing frontline capabilities. The best way to think of this tank is an E3 merged with a 268. Its frontal armor is nearly impervious to any standard ammo. Even tank destroyers can't pen it at this point with standard ammo. It's also got great accuracy, unlike the 268 because it got its slight accuracy nerf when it got its alpha buff. The WZ has amazing pen. It's got everything you'd want going for it. I mean, the pen is actually insane at 413. So when it comes to tank destroyers, if you want a vehicle that can do it literally all, the STB1 of TDs, this is the tank to go for. It's definitely a lot better for frontline capabilities than the 268, so if you want to be a bit more aggressive, this is what I'd suggest to go for. The Boss Shotgun 25-ton, one of my favorite tier 10s in the game. It's got fantastic mobility, it's got a great gun, especially with shell reload boost now the thing's got over 3,000 DPM effective. But the thing to keep in mind about the Batchat is the fact that it's not a beginner-friendly tank, and not even close. If you're a beginner, I would never, ever, ever suggest to grind down this tank. It's got poor gun depression, and it solely relies on the player's skill. If you're great at the game and you like clippers, this is an amazing tank. This will be a vehicle you will never get bored of. I mean, myself alone, I've got over 1,300 games in this tank. I absolutely love it. It was one of my first tier 10s I ground, and ever since then it's been one of my favorite tier 10s. But definitely not a tank I would suggest to grind early on. One that maybe after your 5th tier 10, because man, is it such a fun tier 10 at that. AMX 50B is another absolutely amazing tier 10. It got a 4-shell autoloader, and even though I thought it was going to be a nerf originally, I gotta say it's just an amazing tank after Wargaming did change it. 1,520 damage potential clipped, and it's got great mobility and gun depression and everything else you'd want going for a heavy, except armor. And this is why I would not suggest to grind the 50B even close to one of your first tier 10s. It is really a player just like the Batchet that rewards people that understand how to use it. Sure, you can probably get away YOLOing on heavy side and getting a 1,500 clip out, but most of the time you're not going to get away with that, and you're going to be absolutely nuked and sent back to the garage. So if you understand how to run a tank like the 50B, and you know where to position a big ol' hongler bongler that is of this size, then it's great. But you do got to be careful. Its sides are only 35 millimeters thick, which means every high explosive shell and their mother will pen you. And yeah, that's definitely something you got to be very, very wary of. The Fosh 155 actually received a DPM buff in Update 9.1. It's sitting at 3405 now. I don't know why you'd run vents, but if you are, it's sitting at 3452, which is pretty insane. Fosh has got fantastic penetration. Almost makes me think of the Hoary, because when you load premium, it only loses 15 damage per shot. But the thing about the Fosh is that its accuracy is atrocious. While this tier 10 tank destroyer is incredibly fun to drive, I definitely would not suggest it, down to the fact that its accuracy and its traverse speed are very poor. If you try to rush into the front line thinking that its armor is going to be great, like I showcase in a lot of my reviews on it, then you will be solely mistaken, because it really does not have the best armor. Its frontal armor can be buttered through with heat quite easily, and even though you might get the occasional bounce here and there, the Fosh is definitely a niche tank. It's amazing in certain attributes, really bad in others. I would suggest to grind it if you love tank destroyers, especially frontline aggressive tank destroyers that you can get away with a lot with, but you do got to learn how to play its playstyle, so I wouldn't suggest to go for it first. Get a 113 GFT, get a 268. Now we go to the TVP. While the TVP may have gotten its DPM buff to 2700, while it may have one of the fastest intraclips in tier 10, it will not save you from being a bad player. If you are not good at the game, this is not a tank you should grind. The TVP is one of the worst performing tier 10s in the game. Why? Because usually people that don't understand how to play it try playing this tank. It still only has 2700 DPM, meaning that your average tier 10 medium has 5, 6, maybe even 800 more DPM than you, meaning they'll absolutely smoke you. Not to mention the TVP has literally zero armor, its camouflage is not great, and when it comes to its side armor or rear armor, it is one of the easiest high explosive pens known to humankind. So the TVP, I would suggest to grind it if you understand how to play it. Definitely one of the most enjoyable tier 10s out there, but again, only in the hands of the beholder. Next up, we have the Progetto 65. Honestly, I wouldn't suggest to grind this. Like, it's still one of my favorite tier 10s out there. It's got a great gun, great mobility, and it's an auto-reloader, which makes it super fun to play. But at the same time, why drive the Progetto when it got a nerf to its accuracy again in Update 9.1, now sitting at 0.335, when you can drive, I don't know, a TVP, a Batchet, or any other tier 10 medium at that at this point. It's a great tank if you like auto reloaders, definitely not a bad choice, and even for a good beginner, I wouldn't say it's a bad vehicle, down to the fact that the auto reloading mechanic can definitely save you from people YOLOing you, but yeah, I just feel like the Progetto with its nerfed accuracy at this point is really unenjoyable to watch your shells fly off into the distance and not hit your opponents, so I wouldn't suggest to get this tank, but that's up to you. Finally, we got two vehicles. We got the Kron and the 60. The Kron, I would suggest for anybody that understands the simple maneuver of hull down. There are so many players out there that grind the Kron and that absolutely suck. The Kron is one of the worst performing tier 10 heavies out there because all the good players stopped driving it when it got nerfed and all the bad players are now playing it. And man, it really shows. Any player that doesn't understand how to use a Kron tries using it on flat ground, thinking they're on desert sands, and they just die because it's not a frontline halt or flat ground tank. It is a frontline tank, but only if you hide the hull. If you understand that very simple playstyle, this is definitely one of the most fun and enjoyable tier 10s to play, down to how downright easy it is to win battles. So I think the Kron's amazing, but you do got to be careful. I would suggest this for players that want a more laxed, laid-back playstyle of just sitting in the front line and using your turret armor. Finally, we have the 60, and the 60 is just an amazing tank all around. Definitely wouldn't suggest to grind it as your first tier 10, down to the fact that it definitely has weaknesses, but the whole line is amazing, starting at the tier 8 and tier 9. They're both amazing. And the tier 10 itself, 600 alpha, it can run tungsten shells, adrenaline, it can run provisions that let it go reverse at 20. It's got 7 degrees of gun depression. It's got great everything. Because of that, the 60 TP is by far one of the best tier 10 heavies in the game. Once you grind your first heavy and then your second, I would highly suggest to grind this as maybe your third. Definitely a fantastic heavy. And as long as, again, you understand how to use it hull down, the armor on this tank will work wonders. Either way, this was a very long video, upwards of 50 minutes, so hopefully you enjoyed it, as this was a very long amount of time to spend recording for one single video. If you'd like to see more content like this in the future, maybe for tier 9 or tier 8, let me know. But this definitely took a lot of time, so please consider smashing that subscribe button down below if you haven't already, and apart from that, I'll be seeing you in the next one. Bye-bye!